Javier Montes. The name itself didn't cause shivers in Guadalajara. It was a common name, belonging to a man who strived to be invisible, a face in the crowd of a vibrant and contradictory metropolis, but behind the facade of a quiet employee, of an obedient son, boiled a universe of repression and hatred. This is the story of how this man became one of the most brutal serial killers in Mexico, and the descent into hell he walked is complex and profoundly disturbing. It is a narrative that demands courage to be told. Stories like Javier's are a dark warning. We at Retiro Crime Script, believe it is crucial to explore these shadows. To continue our work and bring more cases with this depth, we need your help. Our goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers. Please subscribe now, activate the bell, and comment on where you are watching from. Your support is the light that allows us to investigate this darkness. Javier's trajectory to this point was marked by an excruciating duality. By day, he was an exemplary employee in a monotonous downtown office, his movements methodical, his voice low, almost subservient. He met the expectations of a conservative society, attended Mass on Sundays with his mother, and maintained an appearance of normality that was, in itself, an exhausting performance. This mask was his first line of defense, meticulously built over decades to hide who he really was, not only from others but principally from himself. The effort to maintain this facade consumed almost all his energy, leaving him perpetually on the edge of a silent collapse, an emotional vacuum yearning to be filled. As night fell, Guadalajara transformed, and so did Javier. He swapped his disguise of normality for the anonymous search for his true nature. He frequented the city's gay community gathering spots, smoky bars, dimly lit parks, and the bohemian zones where the marginalized sought connection. In those places, he was not the obedient son. He was a hunter, but also prey. He watched. He saw the vulnerability in other men's eyes, the same vulnerability he despised in himself. Every exchanged glance, every fleeting touch, was a mixture of desire and revulsion. He sought human proximity, while paradoxically, his hatred for that very need grew, turning every encounter into an exercise in self-aversion. This internal conflict was the core of the rot growing in Javier. Raised under the weight of fervent Catholicism and structural Mexican machismo, his homosexuality was not just a sin, it was a character flaw, a betrayal of his family and God. He internalized every whispered insult, every disdainful look society cast upon the different. He couldn't reconcile who he was with who he was supposed to be. This cognitive dissonance created unbearable psychological pressure. He didn't just hate the world for rejecting him, he hated himself for being rejectable, and by extension, he hated those who reflected his own identity, those who dared to live, even in the shadows, what he so deeply repressed. Guadalajara itself functioned as a character in his story, a labyrinth of contrasts that mirrored his fractured psyche. The city displayed its colonial beauty under the scorching sun, with its majestic plazas and golden-domed churches. But at night, the same streets filled with deep shadows. The working-class neighborhoods, with their peeling walls and narrow alleys, became the setting for his hunt. The air was heavy, laden with the smell of pollution, street food, and the palpable fear of a city that, despite its vibrancy, hid a latent violence. Javier knew these alleys like the back of his hand. They were his sanctuary and his battlefield, the place where his daytime facade finally dissolved into the nocturnal darkness. A specific scene captures his duality. Javier is at a family dinner, the sound of cutlery against plates, the laughter of his nephews, his mother's voice insisting he find a good girl. He smiles, a thin, rehearsed smile, and agrees passively, but his eyes are dead. In his mind, he isn't there. He is replaying the previous night's encounter, the feeling of power he felt watching a stranger in a bar, the adrenaline of almost being discovered. The tension between the docile son at the dinner table and the predator watching in the shadows was almost physical, a low hum only he could hear, a vibration that threatened to break his composure at any second. The contempt he felt was reaching a boiling point. It was no longer just repressed desire, it was rage. He saw other homosexual men not as brothers in an oppressed community, but as personifications of his own weakness. He saw them as promiscuous, dirty, weak, all the adjectives he used to self-flagellate. In his distorted mind, they deserved punishment for embracing what he had spent his entire life denying. The rage needed an outlet, and the internal pressure was becoming volcanic. He no longer sought just anonymous sex. He sought control, and the most absolute form of control was the power of life and death. The mask was cracking. Years of repression had eroded his empathy, leaving only a functional shell. He moved through the city like a ghost, disconnected from the humanity around him. The tension accumulated from a lifetime of denial and self-hatred had reached its limit. Javier Montes was no longer just a man in conflict. He was a time bomb. He walked the night streets of Guadalajara, no longer just watching, but actively searching. He just needed a trigger, a single moment, a single victim for the fury he had kept locked away for so long to finally explode. And that night was coming. The trigger materialized on a humid Tuesday night in a dimly lit park known as a discreet meeting spot. Javier was there as usual, an observer in the shadows, vibrating with the toxic mixture of desire and disgust. He spotted a younger man, perhaps in his early 20s, whose casual confidence seemed a personal affront to Javier. The young man smiled at him, an open, fearless invitation. They exchanged few words and agreed to go to a more private place. They headed to a nearby vacant lot, a cemetery of concrete and tall weeds, where the city's sound was a distant murmur. The air was heavy with the promise of a clandestine encounter, but the tension in Javier was of a different nature. The encounter began like so many others, hurried and anonymous, but something changed. When the act was over, the young man made a casual remark, perhaps a joke about Javier's tension or an observation about his own lack of shame. "Relax, pal. It's not like God is watching," he laughed. For Javier, those words were like gasoline on an ember. The young man's laughter, his brazen acceptance of his own nature, his lack of guilt, it all struck Javier like a mirror of his own failure. The rage he had kept, dammed up for 30 years, exploded. It wasn't a conscious thought, it was a visceral reflex. He grabbed a loose rock from the ground and struck the young man in the head repeatedly until the laughter ceased. Javier stood panting over the body, the silence of the vacant lot broken only by his ragged breathing. The smell of blood and damp earth invaded his senses. He looked at what he had done, at the raw violence his hands had inflicted. But instead of the panic or remorse one might expect, he felt something new, an overwhelming calm. It was a feeling of release, an absolute silence in his mind for the first time in his life. The pressure that had tormented him, the internal dissonance, had dissolved. In that moment of extreme brutality, Javier found a distorted form of peace. He had destroyed the reflection of his own hatred. He wiped the blood from his hands on the tall grass, his movements now calm and methodical. The mask of normality settled back in, but this time it was different. It was no longer a fragile defense against the world. It was a tool. He covered the body superficially with debris and walked out of the vacant lot, blending into the night streets of Guadalajara as if nothing had happened. He walked home, feeling a terrifying clarity. The monster was no longer fighting to get out. It had been invited in. The city slept, unaware that a predator had just tasted blood for the first time and, most terrifying of all, had liked it. As he walked, Javier looked at his reflection in a dark shop window. He didn't recognize the man staring back. That was the turning point. He understood he could no longer go back to being the repressed man he was. That act, that first murder, was not an end. It was a beginning. He felt he finally had a purpose, a control he had never had. Right then, he decided he would no longer wait for the world to punish him for being who he was. He himself would become the punishment. This decision, born from that violence, was what sealed the fate of so many others. It's frightening to think how a life can change so drastically. If this story also moves you, subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue investigating these dark journeys. That first murder opened the floodgates. The calm Javier felt became an addiction, a need that demanded to be fed. The second death came a week later, and the third, 4 days after that. He was no longer the hesitant observer in the shadows. He became an active hunter, his MO refining with each new victim. He learned to choose targets who wouldn't be immediately missed. Disillusioned young men who had run away from home, sex workers who inhabited the margins of society, men who, like him, sought anonymous connections in dangerous places. He used his harmless appearance, his air of an ordinary man, as the perfect bait. The vulnerability he so despised in others was now his primary hunting tool. Javier developed a ritual. He took his victims to isolated places, the same vacant lots, abandoned construction sites, or the cheap hotel rooms in Guadalajara's most run-down neighborhoods. The violence became more controlled, less explosive than in the first crime. He moved from blind fury to calculated sadism. The act of killing was preceded by a psychological game, a moment where he exerted absolute power. He watched the fear grow in his victim's eyes, and in that fear he found validation of his own strength. Every life he took was an affirmation of his control, a symbolic eradication of his own internalized weakness, of the sin he couldn't accept. Parallel to Javier's escalation, panic began to seep into Guadalajara. The bodies started being discovered. At first, the police treated the cases as isolated incidents, crimes of opportunity, or common drunken brawls in the areas where the bodies appeared. However, the frequency and similar brutality soon became impossible to ignore. The local media, sensing a pattern, began connecting the dots, coining the nickname that would haunt the city, El Cazador Nocturno, the night hunter. The fear was palpable, especially within the gay community, which quickly realized they were the primary target, although the police were slow to publicly acknowledge this pattern, perhaps due to prejudice or an unwillingness to thoroughly investigate crimes against marginalized groups. At the Guadalajara Central Precinct, Detective Ramirez, a graying, tired man, was put in charge of a reluctant task force. Ramirez was an old guard cop, cynical, but with an unshakable sense of duty. He stared at the map. In his office, now marked with small red pins, each representing a lost life, there were already 7. He felt the pressure from the media and the frustration of his team. The clues were almost non-existent. There were no witnesses, no clear fingerprints, just a trail of brutal violence. He knew he was dealing with something new, something much darker than the crimes of passion or gang settlements he was used to. Javier watched the growing panic with almost clinical detachment. He read the newspapers in the office, listening to his colleagues speculate about the monster on the loose. He participated in the conversations, offering vague opinions, feeling a surge of power, knowing he was the center of that fear. His mask of normality was stronger than ever. At home, he was the perfect son, caring for his elderly mother, his daily routine undisturbed. The tension of this duality no longer exhausted him. It energized him. The daytime life was the perfect hiding place for the key nighttime predator. He was the wolf in sheep's clothing, living among the flock. The task force gained a new member, Detective Sofia Morales. Young, analytical and determined, she brought a modern perspective that clashed with Ramirez's methods. Sofia was the first to insist they should focus on the gay community's meeting spots, suggesting the killer was likely someone comfortable in those circles, perhaps even a member of the community itself. This suggestion was met with resistance by some. of the older, more conservative officers, but Ramirez, desperate for a new angle, gave her permission to investigate. Sofia began frequenting the bars and parks, trying to build trust with people who had every reason to distrust the police. The victim count rose to 12. The city was on high alert. Javier had to adapt. The usual spots were emptier, or the men were more cautious, walking in groups. This forced him to change tactics. He started using his car, offering rides on rainy nights, his civil servant appearance calming his victims' fears. The compulsion was so strong that the increased risk of getting caught only heightened his excitement. He felt invincible, as if guided by a higher power, a distorted justice that absolved him of all guilt. He was cleaning the city in his mind, cleaning himself. At home, Javier's mother, a devout woman oblivious to her son's darkness, began to notice small changes. He seemed more distant, locked his room, something he never did, and sometimes she smelled the faint scent of bleach on his clothes when he arrived late. She would ask if he was okay, if he was having trouble at work. Javier would just smile, the same thin, rehearsed smile, and say everything was fine, just tired. He would look at her, the source of his religious guilt, and feel nothing but a cold void. Filial love had been replaced by the need to preserve his new identity. Detective Sofia made a small breakthrough. She found a survivor, a young man who had accepted a ride from a man in a dark, discreet sedan. The man seemed normal, even polite, the boy said, but something in his eyes made him panic. He managed to jump from the moving car when the driver tried to divert onto an isolated dirt road. The description was vague. A middle-aged, ordinary man, the kind of face you forget. But it was the first real lead they had. The MO was solidifying, a predator who used normality as camouflage. Javier learned of the survivor from the newspaper. The near capture, rather than scaring him, enraged him. The imperfection, the mistake, made him feel vulnerable for the first time since the first murder. He needed to reassert his control. That night, he went out determined. He found his 13th victim, an older man, in a bar on the outskirts of the city. This time, the violence was extreme, almost frantic. He left the body in a more public place, an alley behind a bustling market. It was no longer just about release. It was about defiance. He was mocking the police, proving to himself that they couldn't catch him. The body of victim 13 was a turning point for the investigation. The excessive brutality and the public location of the body indicated an escalation. Ramirez and Sofia analyzed the crime scene, the tension between them palpable. "He's getting arrogant," Sofia said. "Or desperate," Ramirez retorted. They knew the killer was evolving, becoming bolder. The pressure from the mayor and the media became unbearable. They needed a composite, sketch, a witness, anything. The city was becoming a powder keg, and Javier was the spark. Javier's social circle, though small, also began to notice his strangeness. A co-worker, Miguel, who occasionally had lunch with him, noticed Javier's distant gaze, the way he seemed to look through people. Once, Miguel made a joke about the night hunter, and Javier's reaction was terrifying. He didn't laugh. He just fixed his gaze on Miguel, an empty but incredibly intense stare, before forcing a smile and changing the subject. Miguel felt a chill and, from that day on, avoided being alone with Javier. The mask was beginning to slip, revealing glimpses of the vacuum beneath. Meanwhile, Javier fought his own compulsion. There were days when the urge to kill was so overwhelming he could barely breathe in the office. He would lock himself in the bathroom, gripping the sink, cold water running over his wrists, trying to maintain control. The daytime facade and the nocturnal beast were at constant war. He realized the only way to survive was to merge the two. He could no longer be Javier by day and the hunter by night. He had to be the hunter all the time, hidden in plain sight. This acceptance of his monstrous nature was an internal turning point. Victim 16 was a university student. Unlike previous victims, this one came from a middle-class family with connections. The police could no longer treat the case as marginal. The investigation finally received the resources Ramirez had been asking for. The description of the survivor's car was broadcast on every news channel. The city was officially in a manhunt. For Javier, this meant the game was getting more dangerous, but also more exciting. He knew he had to be more careful, smarter. The entire city was against him, and he reveled in this confrontation. The tension between detectives Ramirez and Sofia peaked. Ramirez wanted a mass sweep, arresting any deviant in the parks, a brute force approach. Sofia argued this would only scare the community and drive away potential witnesses. She believed the killer was methodical and that they needed data analysis, cross-referencing crime locations with schedules, looking for a geographical pattern. "He's not some drooling lunatic," she shouted in a meeting. "He's organized. He lives here. He works here. He's one of us." Javier, sensing the net tightening, decided he needed a trophy, something to remind him of his power during the forced dry periods. With his 17th victim, a man he lured from an upscale bar, he did something different. After the murder, he took the man's wallet and a small silver wristwatch. He hid these items in a shoebox under his bed, along with other small mementos from his previous victims. The box was his secret shrine, tangible proof of his transgressions, a reminder of who he really was. The police were frustrated. The pins on Ramirez's map now numbered 17. The city was terrified. Sofia spent sleepless nights reviewing files, searching for the missing connection. She revisited the survivor's testimony, focusing on the car description. A dark sedan, older model, discreet but well-maintained. It was a small but specific detail. She began pulling records of vehicles that matched this description and had been reported near the crime areas, even for minor traffic violations. It was tedious work, a needle in a haystack. Javier felt the need to strike again. The pressure was building. It had been almost a month since victim 17. He was in the office, the hum of the need returning, louder than ever. He looked out the window at the bustling streets of Guadalajara. He realized he could no longer fight it. Accepting this truth was his true internal turning point. He was not a man who killed. He was a killer pretending to be a man. Tonight he decided he would hunt again. He wasn't just satisfying an urge, he was fulfilling his destiny. This was who he was, and the world would have to accept it. This realization was his decisive action, a final commitment to the monster. He began to plan his next move with meticulous care. He would no longer go to the obvious places. He would use the city's very structure. He chose a cinema downtown, a public yet dark location. He watched the flow of people, looking for someone alone, someone who looked lost. He spotted a potential target. The adrenaline began to pump. He was no longer afraid of being caught. He was afraid of not being able to kill again. The compulsion had completely consumed any remnant of his former identity. Ramirez and Sofia, working separately, were getting close. Ramirez, following an anonymous tip about a strange man seen near the 16th crime scene, was circling Javier's neighborhood. Sofia, with her list of cars, had narrowed the possibilities to a dozen vehicles, and one of them, a dark blue sedan registered to Javier Montes, had 2 nighttime parking tickets near where 2 of the victims were found. The 2 investigative paths were about to converge. As Javier prepared to leave home that night, he stopped in front of the hallway mirror. He adjusted his tie. The image staring back was that of an ordinary employee, slightly graying at the temples, calm eyes. But behind those eyes, the night hunter was watching, hungry. He grabbed his car keys. He didn't know that Detective Sofia Morales was on her way to his street with a photo of him, taken from the vehicle registration, to show the survivor she had located again. Javier's circle, his co-worker Miguel, was contacted by the police. They were investigating all associates of the victims, and by chance, one of the later victims worked in the same building as Javier and Miguel. When Sofia showed Miguel the photo of Javier, asking if he had seen him act strangely, Miguel hesitated. He remembered Javier's cold stare, the chill he had felt. He's quiet, Miguel said, but sometimes he seems empty. That hesitation was enough for Sofia to increase her suspicions. The potential 18th victim was at the cinema, as Javier had predicted. Javier sat a few rows behind, watching. The film was a loud drama, perfect for muffling sounds. He planned to follow the man to the restroom. He could taste the metallic tang of anticipation, his heart beat at a steady, controlled rhythm. He was the predator at the height of his power. He rose slowly, ready to act, unaware that outside the cinema, Detective Sofia and Detective Ramirez were arriving, having finally linked the car, Miguel's testimony, and Javier's location. The investigation's development was slow and painful, a reflection of how crimes against marginalized groups are often treated. The Guadalajara police, at first, were more concerned with the city's image than with justice for victims they saw as disposable. It was only the persistence of detectives like Sofia and the growing arrogance of Javier, which led him to attack higher-profile victims, that finally turned the hunt into a top priority. This social dynamic was a crucial factor that allowed Javier to kill for so long. Javier, in his mind, believed he was doing society a favor. He was the toxic product of internalized hatred and religious fanaticism. He killed the men who reminded him of what he hated most in himself. Each murder was a desperate attempt to purify his own soul through the blood of others. This distorted logic was the cornerstone of his psychopathy, a narrative he constructed to justify the horror of his acts. He wasn't a monster without motive. He was a monster who had created his own terrible morality. The muffled sound of the action movie echoed outside, an ironic soundtrack to what was about to happen. Javier followed his victim, the solitary man, to the men's restroom at the cinema. The smell of cheap disinfectant and mildew hung in the air. Javier locked the main door from the inside, a metallic click that sealed the other man's fate. He turned. The man was washing his hands, oblivious. For Javier, this was the pinnacle, the hunt in a public place, the risk, the certainty of success. It all fed his omnipotence. He savored the silence, the moment when he was God, holding life and death in his hands, ready to execute his final, distorted judgment. Outside, in the cinema lobby, Detective Sofia Morales and Detective Ramirez entered, hurried but restrained. They had located the dark blue sedan parked 2 blocks away, confirmed by the trembling survivor accompanying them. "He's here," Sofia whispered, her voice laden with adrenaline and dread. Ramirez, more pragmatic, signaled for perimeter units to block the emergency exits. They didn't know where he was in the building, only that they were in the same enclosed space as the killer of 17 people. Every second counted. They split up, one covering the ground floor, the other heading up to the theaters, their senses heightened to the extreme, waiting for the first sign of violence. Back in the restroom, Javier took a step forward, his shoes squeaking slightly on the wet tile. The other man turned, drying his hands, and his casual smile died when he saw Javier's expression. "What?" he began. Javier didn't answer. Instead, he executed his plan, his decisive action. He pulled a hunting knife from inside his jacket, a fluid, rehearsed movement. This was the moment he had come for. It was no longer about repression or hatred. It was about pure power. He grabbed the man by the collar, shoving him against the tiled wall, and raised the blade. The terror in the man's eyes was the final mirror of his victory. In the exact instant Javier's arm was about to descend, the bathroom door burst open, the lock shattered by Ramirez's boot. The detective had heard a dull thud, the man hitting the wall, as he passed the corridor. He and Sofia stormed the small space, weapons drawn. The scene they found was a grotesque tableau. Javier, with the knife raised, the victim, paralyzed with terror, a whimper stuck in his throat, and the buzzing fluorescent light of the bathroom casting sickly shadows on all three. Time seemed to freeze, the distant sound of the movie fading into an absolute deadly silence. The predator was caught in his sanctuary. Javier's reaction defined his transformation. He didn't flinch. He didn't show fear. He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Sophia's. The mask of the docile employee, the obedient son, evaporated completely, revealing the icy vacuum beneath. His face was calm, but it was the calm of a shark, a total absence of humanity. The only visible emotion was a cold anger, an annoyance at being interrupted. He still held the knife tightly, his grip firm. He was no longer Javier Montes, the man. He was the hunter, the personification of his compulsion, completely unmasked. "Drop the knife! Now!" Ramirez's voice thundered in the small space. Javier hesitated for a split second, a slight twitch of his wrist that could be interpreted as a continuation of the attack. There was no time for a second warning. Ramirez charged, using his full weight to collide with Javier, throwing him against the urinals. Sophia rushed to protect the victim, pulling him out of the line of fire. The sound of the struggle was brutal and quick, the impact of bodies against porcelain, Ramirez's grunt, Javier's hiss of fury. The knife skittered across the wet floor, stopping near the drain. The capture was not elegant. It was desperate, physical, and ugly. They cuffed him tightly, hands behind his back. When they lifted him, Javier's face was marked by the struggle, but his eyes were victorious. He had been caught, but on his own terms, at the height of his power. They dragged him out of the bathroom, through the hallway, and into the main lobby. The movie had ended. The moviegoers, laughing and chatting, stopped abruptly. Silence fell as they saw the ordinary-looking man, now restrained between two detectives, his face a mask of serene hatred. Javier Montes looked at the crowd, at the witnesses of his normal life, and his empty gaze was the final confession. The duality was over. The monster was in plain sight. In the cold, fluorescent light of the interrogation room, Javier Montes was unrecognizable. There was no fight left, just a disturbing stillness. Facing detectives Ramirez and Sofia, he finally explained the why. There were no tears or remorse. With methodical clarity, he articulated the logic of his carnage. He spoke of the suffocating pressure of religion, of the hatred for his own nature that society had taught him to have. He described his victims not as men, but as symbols of his own filth. Each murder, he confessed with chilling calm, was an act of purification, an attempt to eradicate sin from the world, starting with those who reflected it. His sexuality, the core of his repressed identity, became the justification for his psychopathy. He wasn't getting revenge on society, he was trying to erase himself. Guadalajara woke up to the news with a mixture of relief and profound horror. The face of Javier Montes, the quiet employee, the obedient son, was on every newspaper. The city had to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil was not an external force, but a product of its own environment, cultivated in indifference and prejudice. Small memorials with flowers and candles popped up in the vacant lots and dark alleys, turning murder sites into shrines of mourning. For the gay community, fear gave way to collective anger and a sense of unity forged in tragedy. The 17-plus victim count left a permanent scar on the metropolis's soul, a grim reminder of the cost of marginalization. For those who knew Javier, the revelation was an earthquake. His elderly mother entered a state of catatonic denial, clutching her rosary, unable to reconcile the son she raised with the monster the world now saw. Miguel, his co-worker, was haunted by the memory of Javier's empty gaze, realizing he had eaten lunch daily with the very embodiment of evil. At the precinct, Ramirez and Sofia filed the case. The map on the wall, covered in red pins, was a silent testament to their failure to stop Javier sooner. The capture was a legal victory, but a profound moral and emotional defeat, leaving them exhausted and cynical. Javier Montes's journey was not one of redemption, but of complete submission to his darkness. He didn't fight the monster. He embraced it until nothing else remained. His transformation was the total disintegration of humanity, replaced by a cold compulsion. His story serves as a brutal study of the mask of normality, questioning what truly hides behind the ordinary faces we pass every day. The internalized hatred, fueled by a repressive society, did not create the psychopath, but it provided him with the justification and the perfect victims, allowing his violence to flourish in the shadows of prejudice. The final scene is one of silence. Javier is in a solitary confinement cell, dressed in a pale prison uniform. He stares at a bare concrete wall with the same empty expression he had in the cinema. The calm he found in the first murder is now his permanent state, an absolute vacuum. He has finally succeeded in silencing the internal dissonance, but the price was his own soul. The camera pulls back slowly, leaving him alone in his self-imposed darkness, a prison within a prison. Stories like Javier's force us to confront how fragile civility is. It's a difficult account, but a necessary one. If you believe these deep investigations are important, please subscribe. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these truths to light.